and why Son poisoned my drink at the family dinner. I felt the weight of betrayal hit me in that instant. A tightness in my chest I couldn't ignore. The room was filled with laughter, clinking silverware, and the warm glow of candlelight, but I could see the cracks in my son's behavior, the nervous flick of his eyes, the forced smile that didn't reach his lips. My hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. I kept my calm, letting the anger simmer beneath a quiet mask. I had a plan, and it would unfold far more devastating than anything he expected. I excused myself under the pretense of getting a glass of water. My movements were deliberate, slow enough to draw no suspicion. I could feel my heart racing, but my mind was clear, calculating. The glass in my hand, his intention hidden within, was not going to harm me, not tonight. I had learned something in 70 years. Patience, observation, and silence are the deadliest tools when wielded correctly. I swapped the glasses subtly, almost imperceptibly, a small motion that would have massive consequences. My son, confident in his cunning, had no idea that the very weapon he intended to use would be turned against someone he trusted. Returning to the table, I placed my safe glass carefully, keeping my composure as if nothing had happened. My wife's eyes met mine for a brief moment, sensing tension but not understanding the undercurrent. I took a sip from my water, feeling a quiet surge of control, while I observed my son with renewed scrutiny. His hands were slightly shaky now, an uncharacteristic sign of fear or perhaps anticipation. He laughed at a joke I didn't tell, a hollow sound that betrayed his inner tension. I could feel the anticipation building, like the slow tightening of a spring. 20 minutes were all it would take. 20 minutes, and he would learn the cost of underestimating someone he thought was weak. I watched the subtle signs, the shift in his posture, the way his wife passed him the drink with a confused glance, the fleeting panic that crossed his face as he brought the glass to his lips. He was oblivious to the fact that the threat he had planted would now strike someone he loved more than he cared to admit. Every gesture, every small tick, was amplified through my vision, sharpened by weeks of careful attention and observation. My calm demeanor belied the storm I felt inside. The storm of betrayal mixed with the quiet satisfaction of knowing justice was about to be delivered. The room continued its chatter, the candlelight flickering over polished plates and crystal glasses. I leaned back slightly, letting the ordinary family noise continue around us while my mind counted down silently. The tension was palpable, though they couldn't see it yet. My son's arrogance, his hubris, had blinded him to the fact that I had already anticipated his moves. And in the quiet spaces between bites of food and polite conversation, the seeds of revelation had been sown. 20 minutes later, the moment arrived. His wife froze, her hand trembling slightly as she realized something was wrong. My son's confident grin faltered, replaced by a dawning horror he couldn't mask. His world, built on manipulation and betrayal, began to unravel in that instant. He realized, too late, that the old man he had thought powerless had outsmarted him completely. The realization hit him like a physical blow, the kind of shock that leaves the body rigid and the mind racing. And in that instant, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not of malice, but of justice earned, patience rewarded, and a lesson delivered that would never be forgotten. After that dinner, the tension in the house became almost tangible. My son didn't speak much, but I could see the anxiety etched into his posture, the way his eyes kept darting toward me as if searching for clues he feared he might miss. His wife, meanwhile, was trembling subtly, still processing the shock of what had just happened. I stayed calm, letting them stew in their own fear, knowing that the real lesson wasn't in a dramatic confrontation, but in the slow, creeping realization that the game had completely shifted. Over the next several hours, I observed their interactions with each other. My son tried to act normal, attempting to mask his panic with forced laughter and casual gestures, but every movement betrayed him. His wife's eyes flickered toward me more than once, a silent question in her gaze, but I remained unreadable, letting the suspense grow, letting the tension stretch. Each glance, each hesitant step, was a reminder that arrogance and cruelty have consequences. And sometimes those consequences arrive in silence, unnoticed until it's far too late. I reflected quietly on my own patience. 70 years had taught me to endure, to watch, to wait for the right moment. I had faced betrayal before, from friends, colleagues, and even family, but nothing had been as sharp, as personal, as this. The realization that my own son had tried to harm me cut deep. But the satisfaction of turning the tables filled a different kind of void, one of justice carefully executed. Lessons quietly delivered, and the restoration of balance that arrogance had temporarily disrupted. Hours passed, and I continued to monitor them. I noticed subtle changes. My son's hand trembled slightly when reaching for the silverware. His voice cracked in mid-sentence, and small beads of sweat formed on his brow. His wife clutched a napkin tightly, glancing repeatedly toward me, sensing the quiet authority I held over the situation without understanding why. I didn't speak, didn't gesture. I simply observed, letting the weight of their actions settle around them. Every second was amplified by the knowledge that the glass they had underestimated was never meant for me. And the lesson had been delivered with precision. Later in the evening, the atmosphere became almost unbearable. The quiet exchanges between my son and his wife were tense, filled with a nervous energy that radiated through the room. I could see the fear and confusion growing, the unspoken realization that their plan, their deception, had backfired in the most dramatic way possible. I felt a quiet surge of satisfaction as I reflected on the power of patience, strategy, and foresight. Arrogance is often its own undoing, I thought, and in this case, it had brought them both to the edge of panic and regret. As night fell, I finally moved through the house, casually checking on things while letting them stew in their anxiety. My son avoided my gaze, shoulders tense, while his wife whispered nervously to him, her voice tinged with guilt and fear. I didn't need to confront them yet. The anticipation, the slow-burning dread of realizing their own mistake, was far more effective. Every subtle sound, the creak of floorboards, the soft clink of a glass, the rustle of papers added to the tension, reinforcing the knowledge that the world they had tried to control had slipped completely from their grasp. By the time they retired for the night, I sat quietly in my chair, watching the shadows stretch across the room. The lesson had been delivered not with anger or force, but with careful observation and calculated action. Their world had begun to collapse, piece by piece, and I knew that when they reflected on this night, they would understand fully what had happened and the magnitude of their failure. Patience, foresight, and quiet intelligence had prevailed over impulsive cruelty, and I felt a deep, unshakable calm knowing that justice at last had been quietly served. The morning after the dinner, the tension in the house was almost suffocating. My son moved through the rooms cautiously, each step measured, eyes flicking constantly toward me as though trying to gauge my mood, my awareness, my next move. His wife trailed behind him, fidgeting nervously, occasionally glancing at me with a mixture of fear and disbelief. I sat in the living room, quietly observing, feeling the weight of 70 years of patience and endurance, knowing that the full force of their actions would hit soon. The house seemed to hold its breath along with me, each creak of the floorboards amplifying the tension, each faint noise like a drumbeat counting down the inevitable reckoning. I watched as my son poured himself a cup of coffee, hands trembling, brow furrowed, lips pressed tightly together. He lifted the glass, almost forgetting for a moment the very thing that had caused this careful choreography of deceit, and I saw a flicker of panic cross his eyes when he realized he might have misjudged everything. His wife, still unaware of the full truth, handed him a plate with a forced smile, but her hands shook just slightly, betraying the anxiety she had been trying to hide. I could feel the anticipation building, like a storm rising quietly on the horizon, ready to strike with devastating clarity. As the hours passed, I observed their interactions with meticulous care. Every glance, every hesitation, every subtle gesture was amplified in meaning. My son whispered quickly to his wife, his voice low and strained, as if he hoped the words themselves could undo what had been set into motion. She flinched, pulled back, and stared at him with wide eyes, finally beginning to understand the consequences of their betrayal. The realization crept slowly, inexorably, into their awareness, and I could see the terror take root in both of them. Pride and arrogance, so carefully maintained, were crumbling beneath the weight of their own miscalculations. By late afternoon, I could see the signs of panic taking hold. My son's hands shook visibly now, his eyes darting to the floor, the ceiling, anywhere but at me. His wife leaned against the counter, clasping her hands tightly, her knuckles white, her lips pressed together, eyes fixed on the floor, as if she could will herself out of this nightmare. And yet they were powerless. Every second, every small movement I observed, confirmed that the plan they had conceived, the cruelty they had attempted, had completely unraveled. They were trapped in the consequences of their own making. And the clarity of that truth struck me with an almost painful satisfaction. I allowed the suspense to stretch, letting them stew in the psychological weight of their actions. I walked slowly through the kitchen, my cane tapping softly against the tiles, each step deliberate, echoing slightly in the tense silence. My son flinched at the sound, as if expecting punishment, confrontation, or a verbal outburst, but I said nothing. My calm, controlled presence was far more unsettling than anger ever could be. They had underestimated me for decades, and now they were beginning to understand painfully that arrogance and cruelty often carry consequences that arrive when least expected, later. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the house, I moved to the table where they sat, silently observing the glass my son had almost taken for himself. His hands trembled as he reached toward it, realizing too late the deception I had orchestrated. His wife's eyes widened as the truth dawned on her. The drink that had been meant to harm me was never consumed by me, and the danger had shifted entirely. Panic and horror overtook their faces simultaneously, an expression of shock so pure that it left them momentarily frozen in place. The culmination of their arrogance and deceit was visible in every trembling hand, every widened eye, every shallow breath. By the evening, the full magnitude of what had happened became undeniable to them. My son's confident, manipulative facade had vanished, replaced by terror and shame. His wife, too, was trembling, struggling to process how completely they had miscalculated the situation. I finally allowed myself to move closer, every step measured, deliberate, embodying decades of wisdom and quiet authority. "Do you see now?" I asked quietly, voice calm but laden with gravity. "Every action, every choice, every attempt to deceive has consequences. You thought you could harm me. You were wrong. And now you understand the cost of underestimating someone who has lived a life of patience and foresight." The room seemed to collapse around them, not physically but emotionally. Fear, regret, and disbelief mingled in the silence that followed my words. I remained composed, letting the weight of their guilt settle fully, letting the lesson imprint itself with clarity. By nightfall, the tension had not faded, but their understanding was complete. They had experienced firsthand the consequences of arrogance, betrayal, and underestimation, and the realization would haunt them long after this evening passed. And as I sat in quiet triumph, observing the shattering of their world, I understood a profound truth. Justice, when carefully executed with patience and wisdom, leaves a mark deeper than anger ever could. The morning after the poisoned drink incident, the house was eerily quiet. Even the ticking of the clock seemed louder than usual, marking time in slow, deliberate beats. My son sat in the dining room, shoulders slumped, fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the table. The confident, entitled expression he wore just the night before had vanished entirely, replaced by uncertainty and fear. His wife hovered nearby, fidgeting with a napkin, glancing at me repeatedly, as though silently pleading for explanation or forgiveness. I remained seated, calm, watching, letting the weight of their anxiety grow. Every second that passed tightened the invisible grip of consequence around them. An invisible lesson only they could feel. I observed the small, telling details, the way my son's jaw clenched, how his hands shook whenever he tried to steady them, the shallow rise and fall of his chest as panic crept into his breathing. His wife's movements were equally revealing. She twisted a ring nervously on her finger, wiped at her eyes discreetly, and kept glancing at the floor or walls, avoiding the full reality in front of her. They had underestimated me, and now they were paying the price not with words, not with anger, but with the slow, suffocating weight of realization. Every detail of their bodies, every tremor, every fleeting glance told me exactly what they were feeling: fear, guilt, and the dawning awareness of their own failure. Hours passed. I moved deliberately through the house, checking small things, my cane tapping softly against the floor, letting the sound punctuate the silence, letting it remind them of the presence they had overlooked. I could feel their panic build incrementally, a storm rising quietly but inevitably. My son tried to mask it with occasional laughter, hollow and forced, his eyes betraying every attempt at composure. His wife whispered half-formed explanations, attempting to soothe him while secretly grappling with her own growing terror. I did not respond. I remained calm, collected, the very image of control, allowing them to stew in their own miscalculations. By late afternoon, the psychological weight of their realization became almost unbearable to witness. My son's trembling hands hovered over his glass, unsure, hesitant, realizing too late that the glass he intended for me had never left the table untouched. His wife's face mirrored his terror, wide-eyed cheeks flushed, every muscle tensed as the truth revealed itself in horrifying clarity. The poison they had intended for me had been theirs in a cruel twist, a silent, meticulously calculated reversal. And yet I remained composed, knowing that the lesson would be far more powerful delivered quietly. Without confrontation, I finally spoke, my voice calm, steady, and resonant, carrying the weight of every year I had lived and every experience I had endured. "Do you see now?" I said softly. "Every choice you made, every act of deceit, has consequences. You thought you were clever. You thought you could manipulate and harm me without repercussion. But you were wrong. And now you understand the world does not bend to arrogance, nor to cruelty. It only obeys patience, foresight, and understanding." My words hung in the air, measured and deliberate, sinking into the terror and shame radiating from both of them. The tension stretched long into the evening. I could see my son's eyes darting around the room, his body tense, the fight leaving him entirely. His wife, too, had slumped into her chair, shoulders heavy with realization, hands trembling in her lap. I could feel the quiet storm of their guilt and fear, and I allowed it to swell, knowing the depth of this experience would leave a permanent mark. Every minute passed with a weighty precision, every second amplifying the lesson that cruelty, arrogance, and betrayal are never without cost. As darkness fell and the warm glow of the streetlights outside painted the room in golden orange hues, I stood slowly and moved toward the window. Behind me, my son and his wife remained frozen, their world shattered by the quiet but devastating power of foresight and patience. I reflected on the irony. They had planned harm, yet had never considered the resilience of someone who had lived 70 years. Someone who had learned that silence and observation can be the deadliest weapons. And in that quiet reflection, I understood that justice does not need violence. It needs only patience, strategy, and moral clarity. Finally, I addressed them again, voice soft but commanding. "You have learned something tonight," I said. It is not anger that defines strength, nor is it fear that teaches wisdom. It is the understanding that actions have consequences, and those consequences cannot always be anticipated. You sought to harm me, yet it is your own choices that have undone you. Let this memory guide you, not with vengeance, but with the awareness that deceit, cruelty, and arrogance can only survive for so long before reality intervenes. I paused, letting my words settle fully into the stunned silence. Then I moved to a chair near the window, leaning on my cane, and looked out over the quiet neighborhood. The world outside was calm, peaceful, oblivious to the lessons learned inside. My son and his wife remained behind me, absorbing the weight of their actions, forever changed by the evening's events. I felt a quiet, profound satisfaction, not of malice, but of justice served, patience rewarded, and a moral balance restored. And in that final moment of reflection, I realized that silence, observation, and careful action often carry more weight than anger ever could. True power lies not in confrontation, but in the quiet delivery of consequence, in patience, and in the clarity of justice that time alone can reveal. By the end of the night, they were no longer the people who had tried to harm me. Their fear had humbled them, their shock had grounded them, and their understanding of consequence had forever altered the way they viewed the world. I finally allowed myself to sit back, deep breath flowing calmly, knowing that justice had been delivered not with fury, but with wisdom, patience, and the quiet strength of someone who had lived long enough to understand the real meaning of power. And as I closed my eyes for a moment, I knew one truth above all: the most devastating lessons are delivered silently, but they echo endlessly in the hearts of those who learn them too late.